Echoes in the Deep Brine, Chapter 6, Fugitive Zero. The air was thick enough to drink, a foul cocktail of ozone and the deep, wet penny tang of rust. Each drip of condensation that fell from the weeping pipes above struck the grated floor with a sound like a ticking clock counting down to nothing. We were deep in the guts of the bellows, a maintenance corridor that hadn't seen a directorate sanitation crew since it was first welded together from pre-cascade scrap. Bioluminescent fungi pulsed in sickly shades of green and blue along the seams of the metal plates, the only light source aside from the nervous, flickering beam of my own headlamp. Brecker stood a few paces behind me, a mountain of augmented muscle and grim silence. He wasn't watching me. His gaze was fixed on the oppressive darkness that pressed in on both ends of the corridor. His pulse rifle was held in a low-ready position, its polymer stock a stark, clean shape against the backdrop of decay. Every groan of the Arkology's metal skeleton, a sound that I had long ago learned to filter out, made the tendons in his neck tighten. I ignored him. I ignored the dripping, the groaning, the cloying smell of fungal spores. I focused on the wall. Pathology, I murmured to myself, the word a familiar anchor in the rising tide of chaos. This was my ritual, my own structured survivalism. Caelus Rendor, the chorus's supposed shepherd, was a pathogen. His belief system was the infection vector. Find the source, diagnose the transmission, engineer the cure. It was a simple, elegant syllogism that had defined my life. The fact that the syllogism had failed me so spectacularly before was a truth I kept locked in a deep, dark place. "Find anything, Vask?" Brecker's voice was a low rumble, devoid of patience. "Patience is a prerequisite for analysis," I replied without turning. My gloved fingers hovered over a smear on the corroded bulkhead. It wasn't just rust or grime. It had a texture, an oily, semi-crystalline quality, and it seemed to absorb the light from my lamp. "This is the spot from the informant's report. A known chorus acolyte was seen here, performing a genuflection." I heard Brecker shift his weight, the grated catwalk complaining under his boots. "A genuflection. Of course. Not just, taking a leak."
"The gesture is the critical component," I said, pulling a portable scanner from my kit. The device whirred to life, its small screen casting a sterile white glow on my face. Ritual reinforces the cognitive pathway. Repetition carves the groove of belief deeper into the mind. Where they pray, they leave a mark, not just psychologically, but physically. I pressed the scanner to the smear. A series of graphs and chemical readouts scrolled across the tiny display. I wasn't an outcast anymore. I wasn't Fugitive Zero. For a moment, I was Jorin Vask, Forensic Theologian, and the universe was once again a set of quantifiable data points. The familiar confidence settled over me like a warm coat. "Elevated salinity," I muttered, watching the numbers, "far exceeding atmospheric condensation levels, and trace proteins, non-human, as well as complex hydrocarbons. It's like they're anointing the walls with the stillness itself." Beneath the surface noise of the Arkology, the drips, the groans, the distant hum of the water purifiers, another sound asserted itself. A low, pervasive frequency that vibrated in the fillings of my teeth. The metal hum. Down here was a physical presence. It was the background radiation of life in Haven, the resonant frequency of our shared tomb. Brecker took a step closer, his focus still on the corridor's entrance. "The dampskins have stories about the hum. They say if you listen too hard, it talks back. Metal hum madness, they call it. They have little rituals, tapping patterns on the walls to ward it off. Superstitious nonsense, I said, my eyes still glued to the scanner. A cognitive artifact of auditory pareidolia, triggered by infrasound. The brain creates patterns from noise to protect itself from sensory deprivation. My scanner beeped, isolating a faint vector. A trail, infinitesimally faint but present. The residue was thicker in a specific direction, the molecular decay newer. They had gone this way, and recently. They're layering it, I realized, a flicker of professional admiration cutting through my contempt. The ritual isn't just a single act, it's a process. They're building something, layer by layer, prayer by prayer, creating a pathway. A pathway to where? Brecker asked, his voice tight.
To their sanctuary, to Kalios. I stood up, feeling a surge of the old fire, the thrill of the hunt. This was it. This was the trail that would lead me to patient zero. This way! I pointed down the right-hand fork of the corridor, a tunnel that seemed to swallow the already faint bioluminescent light. It was a maw of blackness, punctuated by the ominous rhythmic pulse of a distant pump. As I took a step, the metal hum seemed to shift. The steady, brain-numbing drone coalesced for a barest fraction of a second. It wasn't my imagination. It wasn't pareidolia. For a sliver of a moment, a voice was braided into the frequency. A whisper, layered 1,000 times over, sliding directly into my auditory cortex, bypassing my ears entirely. Sings the brine. The words were not a sound, but the ghost of a sound, an impression of meaning left on my synapses. My blood went cold. My determined confidence, so carefully reconstructed, shattered like polymer glass. I froze, 1 foot forward. Every rational part of my brain screamed explanations at me. Signal bleed, auditory hallucination, the onset of metal hum madness. My own mind, stressed and paranoid, was projecting the patterns I was hunting for onto the ambient noise. It was a textbook case of confirmation bias. And yet, it had felt real. It felt like a broadcast. Vask? Brecker's voice cut through the ringing in my head. He had noticed my hesitation. He mistook it for fear of the dark. What is it? I couldn't tell him. I couldn't say, I think the walls are whispering to me. It would be an admission of failure, of contamination. It would prove that the faith I sought to dismantle was already worming its way into the cracks of my own certainty. I, who had diagnosed the minds of thousands, could not trust my own frailty. The cautious unease that had been simmering beneath the surface now boiled over into a cold, quiet dread. I was no longer the detached scientist observing the specimen through a microscope. I was in the petri dish with it. I forced my legs to move, my voice to remain steady. Nothing. A structural stress groan. It's unstable down here. I took the lead, my headlamp beam cutting a trembling path into the oppressive dark. Brecker fell into step behind me, the solid, reassuring weight of his presence doing little to calm the tremor in my hands. Keep your footing, he grunted, the traditional Haven farewell sounding more like a command. I didn't reply. I just walked, plunging deeper into the labyrinth, the whisper still echoing in the silent, humming corners of my mind. The trail of rust and whispers wasn't just a path to Kalis Render. It feared it was a path to the heart of the song itself. The air hit first, a physical wall of wet heat and decay. It smelled of ozone from spitting wires, the deep, briny rot of the stillness seeping up through the grates, and something acridly sweet, like fermenting fungus. We were at the lip of a decommissioned water filtration basin, now repurposed. The slurry market. A vast, echoing concrete bowl, teeming with the desperate dregs of the bellows. Brecker didn't pause. He moved into the throng like a barge parting oily water, his augmented shoulders a solid block of menace. He glanced back, his face half lit by the sickly green glow of a nearby algae farm. "Keep your head down. Don't speak. And for Rust's sake, try not to look like you're cataloging us for a directorate report." I swallowed, the recycled air tasting metallic on my tongue. I was a contamination in this ecosystem. My posture too straight. My clothes, though stained from the chase, were of aerium polymer, not the patched-together canvas and scavenged plastic of the damp skins. Every instinct screamed at me to maintain distance, to observe from a clean room, a sterile monitor. But Otho had stripped all that away. Now I was the specimen under the glass. I lowered my gaze, focusing on the slick, corroded floor. The sound was a disorienting symphony of human misery. The murmur of 1,000 hushed paranoid deals, the rhythmic squelch of nutrient paste being ladled from tubs, the high-pitched whine of a failing capacitor from a stall selling salvaged data chips, and beneath it all, the constant, maddening drip of condensation from the cavernous ceiling high above, each drop echoing like a ticking clock. Brecker navigated with a grim familiarity, his heavy boots sure-footed on the treacherous floor. My own felt clumsy, my gait too precise. I felt 100 pairs of eyes on me, some curious, most hostile. A woman with lung-rot scars etched into her neck hissed, "Dry feet," as I passed, her voice a wet rattle. My training fought against the fear. Analyze, deconstruct, find the pattern. I forced myself to lift my eyes, to scan the crowd not as a threat, but as data. I saw the sallow skin, the pervasive dampness clinging to every surface, every person. Stalls were lit by flickering LEDs, and the pulsating blue-green of bioluminescent fungi cultivated in cracked polymer troughs. One vendor was selling what looked like genuine, non-synthetic flavorings, cinnamon sticks, dried peppers, for prices that could indenture a family for a cycle. Then I saw it. A man, gaunt and hollow-eyed, was polishing a piece of reclaimed metal. His arm moved back and forth, back and forth. It wasn't the tired motion of labor. It was perfect, a flawless, metronomic rhythm that didn't waver. His head was cocked slightly, as if listening to a tune only he could hear. I saw it again a few stalls down. A woman sorting through rusted machine parts, her body swaying in a slow, hypnotic cadence that matched the low-frequency hum of a nearby water purifier. It was the refinery sickness, the chanting sickness, here in its larval stage. Not a shout, but a whisper, a cognitive tremor. Metal hum madness, the dampskins called it. A colloquialism for psychosis induced by resonant frequencies. I had dismissed it as folklore, a pre-scientific coping mechanism. But now I saw it as a mimetic carrier wave. The city's own groaning, humming machinery was the vector. The belief was not just spreading through words, but through vibrations in the very steel that held Haven together. Up ahead, the stream of bodies slowed, damming up against a choke point, a makeshift checkpoint. 4 men, their faces obscured by filtration masks, stood under a sputtering white light, armed with lengths of rebar and heavy-duty spanners. A crude banner hung above them, a dripping gear painted in rust-colored pigment. The gutter gears gang. Not directorate. Worse. Unpredictable. Brecker held up a hand, stopping me. Let me handle this. He approached alone. I hung back, trying to blend into the shadows by a stall selling kelp jerky. The leader, a brute with a scarred jaw, stepped forward, resting his spanner on his shoulder. His eyes, visible over his mask, were cold and weary. Brecker. Thought Hydrocorpus kept its dogs on a shorter leash. The voice was rough, filtered through his mask.
My leash is my own now, Torvin, Brecker rumbled, his voice low and steady. We're just passing through. Business in the lower shafts. Torvin's gaze flicked past Brecker, landing on me. I froze. His eyes narrowed. Who's the dry feet? Looks a little clean for your kind of business. The air thickened. The background noise of the market seemed to recede. I was exposed, a sterile anomaly in a petri dish of decay. He's with me, Brecker said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He shifted his weight, a subtle movement that made him seem twice as large. He's debt-marked to a bellows reclamation crew, not worth the rust on your spanner. Torvin held his stare for a long, agonizing moment. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, panicked rhythm against the steady, subliminal pulse of the crowd. He was weighing the kilocals I might have on me against the cost of crossing Brecker. Finally, he gave a curt nod. Keep your footing. The lower levels are noisy tonight. He gestured with his spanner, and his men parted. As we passed, I could feel Torvin's eyes boring into my back. A promise. A threat. We moved faster now, Brecker practically dragging me through the thinning crowd toward the far side of the basin. The unease I'd felt earlier had crystallized into a sharp, cold spike of terror. I wasn't just in danger of being robbed. I was a symbol of the sterile, oppressive authority that had left these people to rot, and I was the catalyst for a plague that was subtly, insidiously taking root in their despair. The rhythmic swaying seemed more pronounced now, or maybe I was just looking for it, a collective, subconscious tide pulling at the edges of the crowd, a quiet hum I could almost feel in my teeth. The chorus wasn't just a cult, it was a biological imperative, an alternative to this slow, damp decay. There, he grunted, pointing toward a dark, gaping maw in the concrete wall, a decommissioned service tunnel, its edges furred with phosphorescent moss. That's the access shaft. Gisla's contact said Rendor's last trade was down there. Relief, cold and fleeting, washed over me. The tunnel meant darkness, anonymity, a reprieve from 1,000 accusing eyes. We were almost there.
Then a sound I hadn't heard since the Arium, a piercing electronic screech. A long-dead PA speaker above a collapsed stall crackled to life, showering the ground with rust flakes. A voice, cold and automated, echoed through the cavernous basin, cutting through the market's hum.
Directive, Selen. Fugitive alert. Jorin Vask. Designated terrorist. Former Forensic Theologian. Charged with biological sabotage and system-wide contagion.
Around the basin, dozens of salvaged monitors and flickering display screens, once showing prices for scrap or nutrient paste, all switched at once. My face, a directorate file photo, stared out, gaunt, clinical, guilty. Beneath it, a number flashed in stark white digits.
Reward, 50,000 kilocals. alive, or confirmed terminated. He is a corporate liability. He is to be considered. The market fell silent. The squelching, the murmuring, the haggling, all of it just stopped. Even the rhythmic swaying seemed to pause. There was only the hum of electricity, the drip of water, and the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. 1,000 pairs of eyes lifted from the screens. 1,000 desperate, hungry faces turned from the pixelated image of me and began to scan the crowd, searching. A young man near the service tunnel, his face barely old enough for bellows grime to have settled into his pores, looked from a screen to me. His eyes widened. He pointed. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. It was enough. Every head in the slurry market turned, every eye fixed on me, and in their faces I saw not just greed, but a terrifying, unified focus. The tide I had observed was no longer subtle. It was a wave, and it was about to crash. The air behind the protein paste vendor tasted of rancid yeast and ozone. It was a pocket of shadow carved out of the bellow's perpetual twilight, a space barely wide enough for 2 men to stand abreast. Water dripped from a corroded pipe overhead, each drop landing with a fat echoing plink onto a pile of discarded nutrient canisters. The only light was the greasy green spillover from the vendor's glowing menu board, painting everything in the sickly hues of decay. Brecker motioned with his chin, his heavy form a bulwark against the thin stream of damp skins shuffling past the stall. "In there," he said to wait behind the condenser unit.
Jorin's eyes scanned the narrow alley. Every shadow seemed to stretch, to hold a shape that wasn't there. His own face, grainy and gaunt, stared back at him from a dozen flickering public info screens they'd passed. The words Fugitive Zero and corporate liability stamped beneath it in stark, authoritarian crimson. The system he had served was now hunting him with the same dispassionate efficiency he had once prided himself on. He was a bug in the code, and Otho was running the extermination protocol. He ducked under a thick bundle of power conduits hanging like dead vines and slipped into the alcove. The smell intensified. Wet rust, fungal spores, and the cloying sweetness of failing electronics. A single figure was slumped in a scavenged polymer chair, wedged between a humming, vibrating condenser and a wall slick with algae. It was their contact. The man Gisela had paid a fortune in Killicows to arrange a meeting with, a chorus acolyte who supposedly knew Kalis Rendor's personal roots through the stillness. Jorin held up a hand, silencing Brecker before he could follow. He took a slow breath, the recycled air scraping his lungs. The man was perfectly still. Too still. In the bellows, even in sleep, people twitched, their bodies clenched against the damp and the constant subliminal hum of the Arkology's machinery. This was a different kind of stillness, an absolute one. "Stay at the entrance," Jorin murmured, his voice tight. "Watch our backs." He moved forward, his boots making no sound on the grime-coated floor. The man was young, maybe 25, with the pale skin and gaunt features of a lifelong damp skin. His head was tilted back, his mouth slightly open. His eyes were closed, not squeezed shut in pain, but resting, as if he'd simply drifted off in the middle of a thought. Jorin knelt. His mind, a finely honed scalpel for dissecting belief systems, immediately shifted into its diagnostic mode. First, the obvious. He pressed 2 fingers against the man's neck, searching for a pulse. Nothing. Just cold, clammy skin. Brecker's voice was a low growl from the alley's mouth. "Well,
Is he breathing?
No, Jorin replied, his gaze sweeping the body. He's gone. Rust rot. Directorate? Did they find him first? Jorin's practiced eyes saw no evidence of it. No stun baton burns, no injection sites for a pacification cocktail, no signs of a struggle. The chair was upright. The man's hands rested peacefully on his lap. He checked the man's wrists for the faint, telltale flicker of a hydrocorpus biometric monitor. It was there, but dark, dead. I don't think so, Jorin said, his own pulse a frantic drum against the oppressive quiet. There's no cause, no trauma. His vitals monitor isn't flatlined. It's just off, as if the battery was instantly drained. He gently tilted the man's head forward. No frothing at the mouth, no petechial hemorrhaging in the eyes. Not poison, then. Not asphyxiation. It was as if every biological process had simultaneously and silently ceased. Brecker shifted his weight, the metal plates in his salvaged armor groaning softly. So what? He just stopped? People don't just stop, Jorin. But they do, a voice in Jorin's head whispered. The memory of the refinery workers, their chants ceasing as they became one with the machines, flashed in his mind. A quiet, horrifying transition. He pushed the thought away. Logic first. Data, always. He unfastened the top buttons of the man's damped tunic, exposing the pale skin of his chest. He was looking for the bioluminescent growths, the weeping, coral-like sores that were the hallmark of the plague's later stages. But there was nothing. The skin was clear, unblemished. He leaned closer, the faint light from the vendor stall catching something, a detail. It wasn't a glow. It was a pattern. Faint, achingly delicate, and utterly alien. Beneath the surface of the skin, spreading out from the center of the man's chest, was a network of fine, white lines. What is it? Brecker pressed, his patience wearing thin. Jorin didn't answer. He stared, mesmerized. The lines branched and rebranched in impossibly perfect geometric intricacy, like frost spreading on a polymer glass pane in a sudden freeze. They weren't veins. They had no organic flow. It was a crystalline structure, a dendritic pattern that looked less biological and more like a printed circuit board. It had a cold, mathematical precision to it. He reached out, his finger tracing one of the lines through the skin. There was no texture, no heat, no energy. It was just there, a silent schematic laid out in flesh.
This was new. The chanting sickness, the hive mind, the physical gross, all of those were terrifying, but they followed a twisted sort of biological logic, a parasitic viral progression. This was different. This was not biology. This was engineering. I've never seen this before, Jorin finally breathed, his voice hollow with a new kind of dread. It wasn't the fear of a monster. It was the intellectual terror of an unsolvable equation. Is it the plague? It's an evolution of it, Jorin corrected, his mind racing. A new symptom, or a final state. He wasn't killed, he was excluded, like a program that is finished running. The thought was more chilling than any violence. The idea that the entity in the deep brine didn't need to attack. It could simply overwrite, turn a living, breathing person into a finished, inert object, a piece of meat made of fractal ice. Their only lead to the heart of the chorus was a corpse displaying a new, incomprehensible phase of the infection, a dead end that was also a terrifying signpost pointing toward an even deeper abyss. "We need to go," Brecker urged, his voice insistent. "Someone will notice us." Jorin stood up, backing away slowly from the chair. He couldn't take his eyes off the man, the placid face, the quiet dignity of his pose. It was a death without struggle, without fear, a quiet end. He felt a surge of pure academic frustration that was so sharp it almost felt like grief. "Rust rot," he muttered, echoing Brecker, but for an entirely different reason. All the questions he wanted to ask, all the data he needed to collect, locked away behind those peacefully closed eyes. He turned, his face a mask of stone. He took one last look at the intricate frost patterns, committing their impossible geometry to memory. The lead was gone. Their path to Caelius had vanished. All they had gained was a fresh layer of confusion and the cold, certain knowledge that they were falling even further behind in a race they didn't understand. Frustration tasted like ozone and rust. Jorin knelt in the filth of the alley, the damp seeping through the reinforced fabric of his trousers. His fingers, slick with grime, pried at the corroded casing of a defunct data hub. Nothing, just a nest of fused wires and the faint, sweet smell of burnt polymer. Rust rot. This was the third dead end in as many hours. The alley was a canyon of technological refuse, a graveyard for the bellows' discarded guts. Piles of cracked monitor screens stared up with dead, gray eyes. Spools of fiber optic cable, long since stripped of their precious core, lay tangled like petrified entrails. The air was a thick cocktail of smells, the metallic tang of recycled atmosphere battling the low-tide brine, the sharp scent of sparking conduits somewhere above, and the pervasive, earthy musk of the fungal blooms that clung to every surface. The only light came from the sickly, pulsing aquamarine of these blooms and the stuttering death rattle of a single white LED overhead, casting their shadows long and skeletal. He pushed himself to his feet, joints protesting. Every muscle ached with a weariness that went deeper than exertion. It was the weight of his new name, Fugitive Zero, scapegoat, terrorist. His own face, rendered in stark, accusatory pixels, was likely still staring from every functioning public screen in Haven. He could almost feel the collective gaze of the Arkology on his back. He ran a hand over his face, scraping away a film of moisture. The lead had been simple, a whisper from a black market stim dealer Brecker had persuaded. A data broker known for trafficking in directorate secrets sometimes used this alley as a dead drop. But there was nothing. No hidden panels, no chalk-scrawled signal, no freshly discarded hardware. The place was cold, a digital tomb picked clean by scavengers long ago.
He was operating on flawed data, chasing ghosts again. The thought was a bitter pill. His entire methodology was built on the purity of information, on separating signal from noise. Now, stripped of his authority, his access, his tools, he was just another damp skin, scrabbling in the dark. "Anything?" Brecker's voice was a low rumble, like distant machinery. It didn't carry so much as vibrate through the enclosed space. "The information was bad," Jorin said, his own voice sounding thin and reedy. He kicked at a pile of broken circuits, the clatter startlingly loud in the quiet drip, drip, drip of the alley. "Or old. We were lied to. Pick one." He couldn't keep the acid from his tone. This was his world. Information, analysis, patterns, and it had failed him completely. Brecker made a non-committal grunt. He didn't care about the why.
He was a creature of the what now, a problem solver whose tools were force and intimidation, not logic. And the current problem was that they were exposed, stationary, and without a destination. A trifecta for a short and violent lifespan in the bellows. Jorin leaned against a wall of stacked, defunct server racks, the cold metal a shock through his thin jacket. He closed his eyes for a second, the rhythmic groaning of Haven's metal skeleton filling his head, that deep resonant hum of stressed pylons and the ceaseless thrum of the water purifiers. Metal hum madness, the locals called the auditory hallucinations it could cause. He wondered if this was it, the start of his own personal cascade. Was he hearing things? The song? The faint, dissonant melody of the plague? Was it just his memory, or was it an echo in the very bones of the city? That's when a new sound cut through the ambient noise. A crackle of static, sharp and intrusive. Jorin's eyes snapped open. Brecker shifted, his body tensing, his head tilting like a predator locating prey. The sound came from a corroded public address horn, mounted 10 feet up the wall, its bell-shaped mouth choked with green slime. It was an ancient piece of tech, pre-Cascade probably, forgotten and left to rot. It shouldn't work. None of them did down here. The static hissed for another moment, then coalesced. Robotic. Jorin Vask.
The voice was female, calm, eerily detached, as it filtered through layers of processing and distance. It had a strange, flat quality, devoid of inflection, yet it was undeniably human. It spoke his name not as a question, but as a statement of fact. In a single fluid motion, Brecker had his sidearm out, the heavy-caliber kinetic pistol a block of dark metal in his hand. He swept the alley entrance, then the catwalks above. Empty. The threat was invisible. Jorin's blood went cold. His carefully constructed analytical mind crashed, rebooted, and crashed again. Directorate? No. Their methods were blunt force. A tactical team would have dropped from the ceiling by now. Hydra corpus? Perhaps. A psychological tactic before the kill shot, but this felt different. It was too precise, too clean. He stared at the speaker horn, at the drip of slime from its lip. The ghost in the machine. "Who is this?" Jorin called out, his voice tight. The static-laced voice replied unhurried. "That is not the relevant question." Jorin felt a flash of his old professional arrogance. "It is the only relevant question. Identify yourself." A sound trickled from the speaker that might have been a dry, humorless laugh, digitized and broken into fragments of noise. "You are still playing the Forensic Theologian, trying to categorize and contain, but you are no longer the one asking the questions." Every word was a perfectly aimed dart, striking at the core of his shattered identity. Brecker took a half step toward the wall, pistol raised. "Where are you?" he growled. "Close enough to see a desperate man trying to solve a puzzle with the wrong pieces. And another man holding a gun he has no one to shoot." The voice was right. Chills spiderwebbed down Jorin's spine. They were being watched, not just tracked, but observed, intimately. Their actions, their frustrations, their very dynamic being analyzed in real time. His gaze darted around the alley, trying to find the lens, the sensor, the hidden eye. He saw nothing but decay. "The data broker," Jorin said, forcing himself to think, to analyze. "The lead. It was you?" "The lead was an echo," the voice stated, the word landing with a chilling resonance. "A piece of old data I knew you would chase. A test, to see if you were predictable. You are."
Jorin's hands clenched into fists. He was a rat in a maze, and this disembodied voice was the scientist taking notes. "You are looking for answers about the chorus of the brine in the city's refuse," the voice continued, its tone unchanging. "You are chasing echoes of the plague on the surface, but the source, Dr. Vask, the real uncorrupted data, it isn't up here in the damp air. It's down in the cold water." The speaker crackled one last time and then fell silent. Only the drip, drip, drip of condensation and the low groan of the Arkology remained. Brecker stood rigid, his weapon still up, scanning the oppressive dark. The alley felt 100 times smaller, the walls closing in. Jorin stared at the dead speaker horn. Frustration had been replaced by a cold, sharp-edged suspicion. They were no longer just running. They had been contacted. The game had a new, unknown player, and she had just given them their next move. The alley reeked of finality. A chemical cocktail of ozone from a sputtering junction box, the perpetual damp rust of the bellows, and now the coppery tang of cooling blood. The dead man lay at Jorin's feet, a canvas of failed faith. His eyes were open, fixed on the weeping, corroded ceiling far above, as if still searching for a signal in the static. Brecker stood a few paces back, a block of granite in the gloom, his augmented hand flexing and unflexing in a slow, rhythmic clench. The only sounds were the steady drip, drip, drip of condensation into a rust-rimmed puddle, and the distant, mournful groan of Haven's metal skeleton. Jorin crouched, his data pad held low, the screen's light making the victim's pale skin look like waxed paper. He was cataloging, dissecting, imposing order on the chaos. It was a reflex, the only one he had left. Subject is male, late 20s. Cause of death appears to be a single low-caliber projectile. No ritual markings beyond the faded coral-like traceries of a stage 1 infection on his forearm. Insignificant. The word was a comfort, a firewall. That's when a new sound cut through the rhythm. A soft scrape. Metal on gritty permacrete. It was close.
Brecker was already moving, his body shifting into a low, predatory stance, his gaze sweeping the deepest pockets of shadow where the glow fungus didn't reach. Jorin's head snapped up, his own heart kicking against his ribs like a trapped animal. His mind, a frantic calculator of threats, spun through the possibilities. Directorate Kill Squad, Hydrocorpus enforcers, a rival ungrounded crew stumbling upon them. Every option ended in a firefight they couldn't win. But it wasn't a squad. It was a single figure, detaching itself from the wall of a derelict shipping container. She didn't lurch or sneak. She simply emerged, as if the shadow had been peeled back to reveal her standing there all along. She was wiry, wrapped in layers of dark, water-stained fabric that broke up her silhouette. A mess of black hair was tied back with a salvaged data cable. Her face was sharp, her eyes catching the faint blue light with a startling intensity. They were the eyes of something that lived in the dark and was not afraid of it. On her wrist, a custom-built bracer flickered with a single, steady amber light. Jorin's first thought was, no weapon visible. That was more terrifying than a drawn gun. It bespoke a different kind of power. "Don't move." Brecker's voice was a low growl, the sound of grinding rock. The servo in his arm whined softly as his fingers tensed.
The woman's eyes flickered to Brecker for a half-second, a dismissive, almost imperceptible glance, before locking back on to Jorin. It was him she was here for. "You're wasting your time with him," she said. Her voice was calm, a low alto that didn't echo in the narrow space. It was a voice accustomed to being listened to. Jorin rose slowly, placing himself between the woman and Brecker, his datapad a useless shield. He slipped into the cold, authoritative cadence he'd once used to dismantle prophets and messiahs. "And you are a concerned citizen," she replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Here to help Haven's most wanted." "Fugitive Zero," he said, the name tasting like ash. "I've seen the broadcasts." "Then you know who the directorate blames for this rust rot." She gestured with her chin, not at the dead man, but at the alley, the bellows, the whole decaying world around them. "And you know they're lying." "My name is
Gisla, ungrounded. Data broker? Black marketeer? Jorin's mind raced, trying to file her away, to reduce her to a known quantity, a variable to be solved. "How did you find us?" "The Bellows has its own information network, faster than the Directorate's and more accurate. You move like a dry-feet theologian, loud, predictable. You left a trail of panicked whispers a blind man could follow." She took a step forward, her worn boots making no sound. "I've been tracking you since you left the refinery quarantine. I know you're hunting the chorus, and I know you think this," she nudged the dead man's boot with her own, "is a clue." Jorin's suspicion hardened into a knot of ice in his gut. This was a trap. It had to be. Otho was clever. A false lead, a Judas goat to lead him into a kill box. "So you're what? Directorate intelligence? Trying a new angle?" he shot back, his voice sharp. "Or are you just a scavenger, hoping to trade our location for a few thousand kilocows?" Brecker shifted, the threat in his posture escalating. "Keep talking," he warned her. Gisla let out a dry, humorless huff of air. "If I wanted you dead, you'd be dead. If I wanted the money, I'd have sold your position an hour ago." Her gaze dropped to the body. "He's a whisperer. That's what they call the new recruits. He heard the metal hum a little too deep, convinced himself the groaning pylons were singing to him. He's a symptom, not a source, a stray signal. You're analyzing static." The casual expertise, the use of the cult's internal lexicon, it wrong-footed Jorin completely. He had torn that term from the fractured mind of an infected worker after 12 hours of brutal clinical interrogation. She spoke it like common knowledge. "You want to find the real source?" she continued, her eyes finding his again, sharp and penetrating. "You want Kalis Rendor?" The name hit Jorin like a physical blow. The air rushed from his lungs. It was a name he'd guarded, the central pillar of his new desperate hypothesis. Kalis Rendor, Patient Zero, the architect of the plague. He'd never spoken it to Brecker, never entered it into any networked device. It existed only in his head and on a single encrypted slate he kept pressed against his chest. "How?" he breathed, the single word a confession of his shock.
"I told you, I deal in information. It's the only currency that matters down here," Gisla said. "And I know you're the only person in this whole rust-bucket Arkology who understands that this isn't a neurotoxin. You see it for what it is, a belief, a structure. You're just looking in all the wrong places." She took another step, now only a few feet away. Brecker didn't stop her. He was watching Jorin, waiting for his lead. "This dead man is an echo," Gisla explained. her voice dropping slightly. "I know where the voice is coming from. A true chorus gathering. They call it the resonator chamber. It's an old sub-level water equalization hub right above the stillness. The acoustics in there, they amplify everything. That's where you'll find the heart of the choir. That's where you'll find your Kaelus." The proposition hung in the damp air, shimmering with possibility and poison. It was everything he was looking for, delivered by an impossible source. His entire being screamed at him to reject it. His training, his life's work was founded on the principle of controlled data, of vetted sources. She was an anomaly, a chaotic element from the lawless depths. Trusting her was an act of faith, the very thing he despised. "What's your price?" Jorin demanded, his voice regaining its hard edge. "The Directorate is trying to delete a problem. The chorus is trying to sing a new one into existence. Both of them are liars," she said, her intensity burning cold. "I'm interested in the truth, the unredacted, unholy truth of what's sleeping in the foundations of the city. You're a forensic theologian, a professional dismantler of gods. I need a tool to help me pry open the box. You'll do." Jorin stared at her. Her confidence was absolute, an unshakable belief in her own purpose. It was the same quality he'd seen in the eyes of 100 cult leaders, the same irrational certainty. She was just another vector, offering another strain of the same disease. He had been betrayed by the system of logic he served. He would not trade it for the chaotic nihilism of the ungrounded. "No," he said flatly. The word was a shield, a wall slammed down. "I don't make deals with drifters." He turned his back on her, a gesture of final, hostile dismissal. "Brecker, we're leaving."
Brecker hesitated for a beat, his eyes lingering on Gisela. Then he gave a curt nod and fell into step behind Jorin. They left her standing there, a lone silhouette in the grimy blue-green glow of the alley, the dead man forgotten at her feet. Jorin didn't look back, but he could feel her gaze on him, not with anger or disappointment, but with a chilling, patient certainty. He knew, with a dread that settled deeper than the damp in his bones, that this was not the end of their conversation. The alley was a wound in the bellow's iron flesh, weeping rust and condensation. Air, thick with the smell of ozone from a sparking conduit and the sweet, cloying decay of fungal farms, felt heavy enough to drink. A single flickering LED strip cast long, dancing shadows, painting everything in a stark, clinical white that fought a losing battle against the pervasive, sickly green glow of bioluminescent algae sliming the walls. She called herself Gisela Rask. She stood with her back to the algae, a silhouette whose features were consumed by the shadows she so clearly commanded. Only the glint in her eyes and the pale line of her mouth were discernible. An ungrounded, a data broker, a parasite in Jorin's lexicon. "The chorus isn't a cult of personality, theologian," she said, her voice a low, steady hum that cut through the constant drip, drip, drip of water from an overhead pipe. "Caelus Rendor isn't their god. He's more like their chief engineer. The plague, as your directorate calls it, is a signal. He just tunes the receiver." Jorin remained silent, his arms crossed. His own face, plastered on every public screen from the aerium to the stillness, felt like a mask he was now forced to wear. Fugitive Zero, a meaningless designation, an irrational label applied by a collapsing system. Beside him, Brecker was a mountain of augmented muscle and quiet menace,
his posture deceptively relaxed, his gaze flicking from Gisela to the alley's exits. "You're telling me you know where he is," Jorin stated. It wasn't a question. He was testing her syntax, her confidence, analyzing the data she presented as speech.
"No," Gisela replied, and the single word was sharp, precise. "That's what you directorate thugs don't get. He isn't a person to be found, he's a function to be located. I know the location of the primary node, the sanctum where the signal is focused before it propagates through the bellows. The place where the metal hum is tuned into a hymn." Jorin's mind raced. Primary node, tuned, propagates. She spoke his language, the language of systems, of vectors and transmission. It was jarring coming from a creature of the city's unregulated depths, a rat that had learned to read schematics. He felt a prickle of professional irritation. This was his domain. And I'm to believe an ungrounded scavenger stumbled upon the epidemiological nexus of a city-wide mimetic crisis? He asked, the words clipped and sterile. How fortunate. "I don't scavenge for luck, theologian. I trade in information. It has a structure, a value, a trail. I followed it." She took a step forward, and the light caught a lattice of old data ports crudely installed along her temple. Black market hardware, a walking security risk. "I'm not offering you this out of civic duty." "Then we've arrived at the transaction," Jorin said, a cold, empty satisfaction settling in his gut. This, he understood, the simple, grubby mechanics of self-interest. It was a predictable variable. "What's your price? Kilocows? Black market stims? Anonymity?" "Information for information," Gisela said, her voice dropping slightly, becoming more intense. "I will give you the precise coordinates of the sanctum. In return, I want a single key, a directorate data archive cipher." Brecker shifted, the servos in his legs letting out a low hydraulic hiss. Jorin didn't look at him. "Which one?" "Archive 72 Delta, unredacted."
The dripping of the pipe seemed to get louder, each drop a hammer blow against the silence. 72 Delta. Jorin felt a jolt, a cold spark of genuine surprise that he immediately suppressed. Archive 72D wasn't just classified, it was a ghost file. The unredacted founding logs of Haven, the raw data from the initial geological surveys before Hydrocorpus had sanitized the records. It was a file he himself had only read about in the most restricted security manuals, rumored to be air-gapped on a pre-cascade server deep in the stillness. It was knowledge that had no black market value in kilocows. It was foundational. His analysis of her shifted. This wasn't a simple opportunist. This was a scalpel digging for the Arkology's heart. And his access codes, his stolen identity with a key she needed to turn the lock. The thought was repellent. His knowledge, his status, his entire being reduced to a bargaining chip for a grubby data thief. "No," Jorin said. The word was flat, absolute. Gisela tilted her head. "You haven't even considered it." "There is nothing to consider." Jorin took a step towards her, invading her space. His eyes, accustomed to the low light, picked out the wariness in her face, the faint tremor in her hand. Symptoms. He was a doctor, and she was just another part of the city's sickness. "You're a variable, an anomaly. Your motivations are complex and therefore unreliable. Accepting your offer would be introducing a contaminated element into a controlled experiment." Brecker bit a low sound in his throat. "Jorin," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone, "we're cornered. The experiment is shot to rust rot. If she knows where to go, she is an opportunist trying to leverage a crisis for personal gain. Jorin cut him off, his voice rising with a cold, intellectual fury. She wants access to foundational data that could destabilize what little order remains. For what? To sell to off-world salvagers? To another corporate entity? Her request proves she is a greater threat than a shortcut is a benefit.
He locked his eyes on Drislas. I will find Caelus Rendor. I will do it through methodical forensic analysis of the contagion spread. The hymn, as you call it, has a structure, a pattern. It is propagating along established pathways, power conduits, water reclamation pipes, resonant metal frequencies. It is a problem of logic, and I am the only one left in this rust-bucket city who still knows how to apply it. His arrogance was a shield, thick and polished. He needed it. It was the only armor he had left after the Directorate had stripped him of everything else. To admit he needed her help would be to admit his entire worldview, his very identity, was insufficient. It was a weakness he could not afford. Gisela watched him, her expression unreadable. For a long moment the only sounds were the groaning pylons of Haven itself, the city sighing in its sleep. Then she gave a slight, almost imperceptible shrug. "Sigh. Your choice, theologian," she said, her tone devoid of malice or frustration. It was worse. It was pity. But logic takes time. You don't have any. The song is getting louder. She didn't wait for a reply. She simply turned and melted back into a fissure between two repurposed shipping containers, vanishing as if the shadows had swallowed her whole. Jorin stood rigid, his jaw clenched so tight his teeth ached. He had won. He had maintained the integrity of his method. He had refused to be compromised. "That was a mistake," Brecker said, his voice flat. "It was a calculated decision," Jorin corrected, turning to walk away down the slick, algae-covered alley. "She was a parasite. We proceed with the primary objective." Brecker didn't move for a second. He stared at the empty space where Gisela had been, his broad face a mask of deep, profound doubt. Then, with a heavy sigh of a man following a fool into a flood, he fell into step behind Jorin. Jorin didn't look back. He focused on the path ahead, on the symphony of decay around him, the hymn. It was just noise, a signal to be decoded, filtered, and silenced. He didn't need a key from a ghost. He was the key.
The rusted hatch groaned open under Brecker's augmented strength, a sound like a dying beast. A wave of cold, strangely sterile air washed over them, a stark contrast to the thick fungal soup of the bellows access tunnels. Jorin pushed past, his hand terminal clutched like a holy text. His headlamp beam caught a nervous path through the oppressive darkness, revealing a space that was impossibly vast. They stood on a graded catwalk overlooking a cavernous cylindrical chamber. Its curved walls were made of pitted dark concrete, descending into a blackness so complete it seemed to drink the light. Dominating the center of the abyss were three colossal pistons, each the width of a hab container, motionless and silent. They were caked in layers of rust and pale calcified deposits, like the bones of some long-dead leviathan. The air smelled of cold metal and ozone, a clean, dead scent that scrubbed the familiar brine and rot from the sinuses. "This is it," Jorin said, his voice a little too loud in the sudden quiet. He was trying to project confidence, the resolve of a man whose logic had led them to the enemy's doorstep. He swept his light across the titanic machinery.
Level 89 resonance dampening station. Decommissioned for 50 years. Its function was to absorb the Arkology's structural vibrations, to prevent sympathetic resonance from shaking the pylons apart. Brecker didn't reply. He moved to the edge of the catwalk, his grip tight on the safety rail. His own lamp beam probed the darkness below, finding nothing more than shadow. He was a statue of coiled tension, a predator in a place where he could no longer trust his senses. The usual cacophony of Haven, the drips, the groans, the distant shriek of grinders, was gone. And its absence was a noise all its own. Then came the hum. It started not as a sound, but as a feeling, a deep seismic thrum that resonated up through the soles of Jorin's boots, through the metal of the catwalk, and into the marrow of his bones. It built slowly, a bass note so low it was felt more than heard, pressing in on his chest and making the air feel thick as water. Jorin swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. He tapped at his terminal, forcing himself back into the familiar comfort of data. The old geothermal pumps, they must run on a subharmonic cycle even in standby. This chamber, its very design makes it an acoustic focusing lens.
He sounded triumphant, the forensic theologian who had found the pathological mechanism behind the miracle. Don't you see, Brecker? This is how they do it. This is their cathedral. The metal hum madness the dampskins whisper about. It's not random, it's focused. The chorus brings their initiates here. They use this amplified frequency to induce a state of cognitive entrainment. It primes the brain for suggestion, makes the mimetic payload of their doctrine more infectious. It's not a god, it's just acoustics and basic neurobiology. Brecker finally turned, his face half lit by the glow of Jorin's terminal. His expression was grim. "It's quiet," he said. The hum was still vibrating through everything, a physical presence, but Brecker was talking about something else. "What are you talking about? Jorin began. But then the hum crested. For a full 10 seconds, it was an overwhelming physical force, making the fillings in Jorin's teeth ache, and the fluid in his eyeballs seem to quiver. Then, just as suddenly as it peaked, it cut out. Completely. And there it was. The silence. It was absolute, utterly profound. A perfect dead vacuum that pressed on the eardrums with an almost physical weight. In that void, Jorin could hear the frantic thump of his own heart, the wet sound of his own breathing. It was the silence of a tomb, sealed off from the universe. It lasted for 3, 4, 5 seconds. Seconds that stretched into an eternity. "That," Brecker said, his voice a low growl that barely disturbed the stillness. "That's what I'm talking about. The quiet. It's wrong." The hum began its slow climb again, a rising tide of vibration that felt almost like a relief. Jorin let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "It's just the cycle," he said, his voice shaking slightly. He cleared his throat, annoyed at his own reaction. "The space between the pump cycles. It's acoustically perfect in here. No echo, no ambient noise. It's disorienting, that's all." "No," Brecker insisted, taking a step closer. He wasn't looking at the machinery anymore. He was looking at the empty air in the center of the chamber. "In the bellows, there's always noise. Always a drip, always a creak, even in the quiet spots. Here, it's like something's holding its breath."
Jorin scoffed, a brittle, nervous sound. "Don't be absurd. You're letting the atmosphere affect your judgment. We need to find their entry point, where they bring the afflicted." He turned his back on the abyss, shining his light along the catwalk, looking for side tunnels or hidden ladders. It was a conscious act of denial, a retreat into the procedural. Find evidence, analyze data, ignore the crawling sensation on your skin. He felt it before he heard it, a change in the quality of the hum. It was still rising, but now a secondary frequency was woven through it, a high-pitched, almost inaudible whine. It scraped at the edges of his hearing like fine-toothed static. His terminal screen flickered, a line of corrupted green data flashing across the display before vanishing. "Rust rot," he muttered, tapping the device. "Signal bleed from the pumps is stronger than I calculated." "Jorin." Brecker's voice was sharp, urgent. Jorin turned, annoyed. "What is it? I'm trying to—" He stopped. Brecker hadn't moved. He was still staring out into the vast, dark center of the chamber. He raised his hand slowly and pointed his headlamp beam downwards. Jorin followed the beam with his own light. It cut through the gloom past the colossal, motionless pistons and into the darkness below. For a moment he saw nothing. Then his eyes adjusted. The bottom of the chamber wasn't a solid floor. It was water. But it wasn't right. The surface was perfectly, unnaturally smooth, like black glass. When the low hum vibrated through the catwalk, the water didn't ripple. It didn't shiver. The surface seemed to bulge upwards in a slow, silent dome, holding its shape for a second, before settling back into impossible flatness. It behaved like a thick, viscous gel, not water. It was the color of absolute night, and from its depths a faint, sickly blue-green light was beginning to pulse, a slow, rhythmic beat that was perfectly in sync with the silence between the hums. Jorin's arrogance evaporated, replaced by a cold, hollowing dread. His grand theory about acoustics and neurobiology felt pathetic, a child's drawing of a hurricane. The chorus didn't come here to use the hum. They came here to appease the silence. The hum wasn't the source of the madness. It was the cage. The blast door to the resonance-dampening station groaned open on rusted hydraulics, releasing a gust of air thick with the smell of ozone and cold, damp iron. It was a space built to counteract a problem, one of the many patches on Haven's decaying hull. According to the schematics, this place was supposed to be quiet, a pocket of engineered silence in the bellow's perpetual cacophony. It wasn't. The metal hum was here, louder than in the corridors. It was a physical presence, a deep foundational thrum that vibrated up through the soles of Jorin's boots and settled in his teeth. He held up a hand, signaling a halt. Brecker, a heavy silhouette behind him, froze instantly, his salvaged pulse rifle held in a low, ready stance. The only light came from their shoulder-mounted lumens, cutting twin cones through the humid darkness. Water dripped from a latticework of pipes overhead, a steady metronomic beat against the bass note of the hum. "Station's offline." Brecker's voice was a low rumble, barely rising above the noise. "No power readings on the access panel." "But it's working," Jorin murmured, more to himself than to the enforcer. His gaze swept across the cavernous chamber. Massive, coffin-shaped converters of rust-pocked steel lined the walls, connected by thick bundles of cable that snaked across the floor like dead pythons. This machinery was designed to generate counterfrequencies, to cancel out the maddening drone that plagued the bellows. But it was doing the opposite. It was amplifying it. "This is it," he thought, a cold knot of certainty tightening in his gut. This is their cathedral. The chorus found a way to hijack the system. They're using it as a broadcast antenna. "I need to get to the central regulator,"
Jorin said, his voice tight. Look for any unauthorized hardware. Signal boosters, frequency modulators, anything that doesn't match Directorate spec. And if we find chorus members instead? Brecker asked, his head scanning the deep shadows between the converters. Then we have found our evidence. The words felt hollow, a line from a manual he no longer believed in.
They moved deeper into the station, their footsteps echoing strangely, the sound swallowed by the oppressive hum. Jorin pulled out his multi-scanner, its screen flickering to life and casting a pale blue light on his face. He ran a diagnostic, sweeping the device across the nearest converter, the screen filled with junk data, lines of code glitching into fractal patterns before resetting. Signal bleed. Badly. Something's wrong with the hum, Brecker stated, his body tense. It's changing. Jorin lowered the scanner and listened. Brecker was right. The monolithic drone was beginning to fray at the edges. A new sound was weaving its way in, a higher-pitched whine that seemed to slither just beneath the main frequency. Then a third layer joined it, a rhythmic pulsing beat like a monstrously slow heart. The air pressure shifted, making Jorin's ears pop. It was no longer just noise. It was becoming structured. Discordant, yes, but structured. They're harmonics, Jorin breathed, his mind racing. It's a deliberate manipulation of the sound waves. Sophisticated. They're creating a complex signal, a carrier wave. Then he saw it. On the far side of the chamber, a faint light bloomed on the corroded surface of a regulator unit, a sickly algae-green glow that pulsed once, then vanished. "Contact?" Brecker whispered, raising his rifle. "No. Wait." Another light appeared on an adjacent machine, then a third further down. They weren't random flashes. They pulsed in perfect synchrony with the new rhythmic beat in the hum. Jorin felt a prickle of unease crawl up his spine, a purely instinctive dread that his rational mind fought to suppress. It's just LEDs, he told himself, a simple light show timed to an audio frequency, crude psychological warfare. He'd seen it a dozen times before in lesser cults. He pushed forward, drawn by a need to dissect the trick, to lay its crude mechanics bare. "Brecker, cover me."
As they advanced, the phenomenon intensified. Lines of green and blue light began to race between the initial points, connecting them. They weren't straight lines, but branching, dendritic patterns like frost spreading on a polymer glass pane, or veins, or the intricate, terrifyingly organic structure of coral. The hum grew louder, the separate tones weaving into a grotesque, atonal melody that seemed to bypass his ears and resonate directly with his skull. The song of the walls. Jorin reached the first converter that had lit up. He shone his lumen directly on the glow. His breath hitched. This wasn't a light show. There were no wires, no projectors, no LEDs drilled into the metal. The light was coming from the metal itself. Growing out of the rusted steel were strange, convoluted shapes. They were pale and fleshy, glistening with moisture, and arranged in the fractal patterns of a neural network. They looked biological. He watched, mesmerized, as a new tendril of light extruded itself from a seam in the machine, unfurling like a time-lapse fern. It pulsed with a soft internal luminescence, a living green that seemed to drink the darkness around it. "Rust rot," Brecker swore, his voice strained. "What is that stuff?" "I don't know." Jorin's professional detachment was shattering. He raised his scanner, his hand trembling slightly. The device whirred, its sensor struggling to process the information. The screen flashed between inorganic alloy and unknown biological. It couldn't decide what it was looking at. Because it was both. The machine and the growth were becoming one. He had to be sure. He had to touch it. His training screamed at him not to, but the forensic theologian, the man who needed empirical data above all else, was in control. He reached out a gloved hand, his fingers hesitating just inches from a pulsing, coral-like ridge. The air around it was strangely cold. He pressed his fingertips against it. It wasn't hard. It yielded under the pressure, the texture slick and firm, like damp cartilage. It was warm. It was alive. The moment he made contact, the hum in the room surged, the discordant song climbing an octave into a piercing shriek. The light of the growths flared violently, bathing the entire chamber in a strobing, sickly green-blue light. Jorin snatched his hand back as if burned, stumbling away from the converter.
His own thoughts were a chaotic roar of denial. It's a fungus, a bioreactive mold that responds to sonic vibrations. There's a rational, pathological explanation. There has to be. But the patterns were spreading faster now, consuming the machinery. Entire converters were disappearing under the pulsing, cancerous growth. The metal wasn't just a host, it was a nutrient. The infection wasn't just in the people, it was in the Arkology itself. It was overwriting reality at a physical level. "Jorin." Brecca's voice was tight with alarm. "Jorin, look." He followed Brecker's trembling aim. Across the chamber, the spreading light was no longer confined to the machines. It had reached the wall. A thick, glowing tendril was creeping up the weeping concrete, leaving a trail of luminous fungal lace in its wake. It was heading for a ventilation conduit, a conduit that connected this station to the bellows' central air circulation. Jorin stared, his scientific mind finally, catastrophically silent. The rigid framework of his worldview had fractured. This wasn't sabotage. This wasn't a trick. This was a symptom of a disease that didn't just infect minds, but the very matter of their world. The metal hum wasn't a carrier wave for the infection. The hum was the infection. The sound was the vector, and the song was just getting started. The central chamber of the transit station was a hollowed-out lung, breathing a constant low-frequency hum. Water dripped from corroded ventilation shafts, each drop a percussive note in the monotonous symphony of Haven's decay. Jorin moved through the oppressive humidity, his worn boots sticking to the grimy film on the grated catwalk. Beside him, Brecker was a monolith of tense silence, his corporate-issue pulse rifle held at a low ready. Every flicker of a failing LED, every distant groan of stressed metal sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through Jorin's system. His face was on every public terminal, his name synonymous with terror. He was Fugitive Zero. He was a ghost, and the whole city was hunting him. "We cut through here." Brecca's voice was a low rasp, barely rising above the noise. "Maintenance tunnels on the far side connect to the lower bellows conduits. We can lose ourselves in the maze."
Jorin nodded, his gaze sweeping the cavernous space. Giant, defunct passenger trams rested in their berths like steel carcasses, their surfaces furred with patches of sickly green bioluminescent fungus. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and something else, something cloyingly sweet beneath the ever-present brine and rust. The smell of rot, but a different kind of rot, an organized decay. That was when he noticed it. The hum. It had been the background radiation of his entire life in Haven. The metal hum the damp skin spoke of. But this was different. A subtle change in pitch, a new harmonic layer weaving itself into the drone. It was higher now, more resonant, vibrating not just in his ears, but in the bones of his skull. "Brecker," Jorin said, stopping. "Do you hear that?" Hear what? The converter's cycling? Brecker didn't slow. Keep moving, Vask. Paranoia is a luxury we don't have. No, it's not the converters. It's the frequency. It's melodic. Before Brecker could retort, the new melody answered.
They were drawn to them. Not by sight, Jorin realized with a cold dread, but by the discordance. He and Brecker were two dissonant notes in their perfectly tuned choir. The infected moved with a twitching, unnatural speed, their feet barely seeming to touch the floor. The hum intensified, and the bioluminescent patterns on their bodies flared brighter, painting the damp chamber in shifting waves of blue and green. "Back! Get back, Vask!" Brecker yelled, shoving Jorin behind him. The world dissolved into a cacophony of sound. The sharp, concussive thump of Brecker's pulse rifle, the high-pitched chittering of the infected, the deep, resonant hum that seemed to be commanding them. Brecker's first shot was a clean hit, striking the lead creature square in the chest. Jorin, the analyst, couldn't look away, his mind cataloging the impossible result. There was no impact splatter, no cry of pain. Instead of tearing through flesh, the kinetic round was absorbed. The coral-like growth at the point of impact flared with a blinding light, the turquoise shifting to a brilliant white for a split second. The creature didn't even stumble. It just kept coming. My God, Jorin thought, his scientific worldview crumbling into dust. It's not just a growth, it's reactive armor. It's biokinetic plating. The plague isn't just infecting them, it's upgrading them. "They're not going down!" Brecker roared, firing again and again. Each shot was met with the same flash of light, the same unnerving lack of effect. He was wasting ammunition, buying them seconds at best. One of the creatures lunged, its arm a blur. Brecker sidestepped, slamming the butt of his rifle into its head with a sickening crack of bone and crystal. The creature spun away, but another was already there, its fingers, now elongated and sharp as shale, swiping at his face. "Run!" Brecker bellowed, firing around into the floor at their feet. The impact sent a shower of sparks and shrapnel into the closest attackers, making them recoil for a precious instant. "Maintenance door! Move, Vask, now!"
The command broke Jorin's paralysis. He turned and ran, his lungs burning, his mind a maelstrom of terror and fascination. They were not just a mob of infected. They were a single organism. He could see it in the way they moved, a shared consciousness guiding them, flowing through the very air, carried on that damn hum. This wasn't a symptom. It was a strategy. A new form of life was asserting itself. Brecker was right behind him, laying down suppressing fire. A stray round hit a bundle of pipes overhead, and a spray of cold, foul-smelling water rained down on them. Jorin slipped, his hands skidding across the slick grate. Brecker grabbed the back of his collar and hauled him to his feet without breaking stride. "Don't just stand there, you rust-rotted analyst! The door!" The heavy pressure door was 30 feet away, its emergency release wheel glowing a faint, hopeful red. Behind them, the chittering was getting closer, faster. Jorin risked a glance back. There were more of them now, at least a dozen, their combined glow turning the transit station into a pulsing, otherworldly cathedral. They were the new choir, and this was their hymn. They reached the door. Brecker didn't bother with the wheel. He slammed his armored shoulder into the release panel beside it. With a deafening hiss of deep pressurizing air, the thick steel slab slid shut. The thud of it locking into place was the most beautiful sound Jorin had ever heard. It was followed, a second later, by a heavy, wet thump against the other side. Then another. Then a deep metallic screech as sharpened fingers of bone and coral raked across the steel. Jorin and Brecker stood in the narrow, dark corridor, their panting breaths echoing off the walls. Brecker leaned heavily against the cold door, the barrel of his rifle smoking. Jorin stared at the door, at the thin seam at its base. A soft, rhythmic blue-green light was pulsing from the other side, casting faint, dancing shadows into their small sanctuary. And with the light came the hum, quieter now, but still there, vibrating through the metal, a unified, malevolent chant. "We can't stay here," Brecker gasped, wiping sweat and grime from his forehead. Jorin didn't answer. He could feel it, a phantom vibration in his own chest, a sympathetic resonance. His heart was hammering, trying to match the impossible rhythm from beyond the door.
The heavy polymer doors slammed shut with a sound like a cracking bone, instantly cutting off the distant, distorted shrieks from the corridor. Brecker threw his weight against it, his augmented arm groaning as he forced the corroded locking bolts into their sockets. The final bolt slid home with a percussive clang that echoed once in the sudden, profound silence, then died. For a moment, there was nothing. No dripping water, no groaning pylons, only the ragged sound of their own breathing, thin and sharp in the dead air. They were in a derelict comms hub, one of the old directorate's listening posts from the Arkology's founding years, its walls padded with thick, sound-dampening foam that was now stained black with mildew. The air tasted of burnt ozone and dust, a dry, sterile scent layered over the usual wet rust decay of the bellows. It was a tomb of forgotten signals. Jorin leaned back against the cool, slimy padding, his chest heaving. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic biological rhythm in a room built to erase all sound. A single emergency LED on the far wall pulsed a weak, sickly green, casting their shadows long and skeletal across a bank of dead consoles. Cracked screens stared back at them like vacant eyes. "Safe?" Brecker rasped, the words swallowed by the soundproofing. He slid down the door, his large frame slumping in exhaustion. He ran a hand over his face, leaving a smear of grime. "For now." Jorin nodded, unable to form a coherent reply. The images were seared into his mind. The way the refinery workers had moved, not like a mob but like a single organism. The way the metal catwalk had twisted under their collective will, bending into a spiral staircase that defied all structural engineering. It wasn't mass hysteria. Hysteria didn't rewrite physics. He watched as Brecker began methodically checking his gear. The enforcer was a creature of practicalities, his mind always on the next immediate threat. Jorin's own mind, however, was spiraling into an abyss of failed theory. His entire professional life, his entire system of belief, or non-belief, was predicated on the idea that faith was a software glitch in the human brain. What he had just seen was a hardware problem, a bug in the operating system of reality itself.
Brecker stopped his inventory check. He held his left forearm out, tilting it into the faint green light. A deep, angry gash ran from his wrist to his elbow, torn through the reinforced fabric of his jacket. It was dark, but not bleeding profusely. The edges were already puffy and inflamed. He'd caught it on a piece of jagged, reshaped metal during their escape. Metal shaped by the bare hands of an infected worker. "Rust rot," Brecker muttered, his voice low and tight. Jorin pushed himself off the wall, his own exhaustion forgotten. He crossed the small room in 3 quick strides, his diagnostic instincts kicking in, a desperate lurch back toward familiar ground. He knelt, his own light emitter casting a harsh, clinical white beam onto the wound. Let me see. The flesh was shredded, but it was the quality of the surrounding skin that made Jorin's breath catch. Tiny phosphorescent green lines, faint as whispers, were branching out from the edges of the cut, forming delicate coral-like patterns beneath the epidermis. They pulsed with the same sickly light as the emergency LED on the wall. "When did this happen?" Jorin asked, his voice a strained whisper. "The catwalk. One of them. She didn't even seem to notice me. Just reached out, and the metal she was holding on to, it peeled away, caught me on the way past." Brecker's jaw was a knot of tension. He stared at his arm, not with fear, but with a kind of grim, fatalistic assessment. "Is it in me? Is it in you?" The question was a scalpel cutting through Jorin's last layer of denial. He looked from the glowing patterns on Brecker's arm to the dead consoles, the inert wires hanging like dead vines. He stood up and began to pace, a caged animal in a 4-meter box. His mind was a frantic cascade of data points that refused to compute. "It's not a neurotoxin," Jorin said, the words falling flat in the silent room. He was speaking to himself more than to Brecker. "It's not a bacterium or a virus in any classical sense. A biological agent doesn't resonate with inorganic material." He stopped, running both hands through his damp hair. "The chanting sickness. We thought it was auditory, a mimetic pathogen carried on sound waves. Then the spores, an airborne vector. Simple, horrifying, but understandable. Contagion models exist for that."
He turned to face Brecker, his eyes wide with a terror that was cerebral, not visceral. "But this is something else. The metal hum madness the damp skins talk about, the low-frequency resonance of the Arkology's machinery. We logged it as a precursor to communal delusion, a shared auditory hallucination. We were wrong." Brecker watched him, his expression unreadable. "Wrong how?" "It's not a hallucination. It's a carrier wave." Jorin's voice cracked. "The infection, it's using the city's own infrastructure as a transmission medium. The hum of the water purifiers, the groaning of the pylons, the electrical buzz in the walls. It's not just background noise, it's the nervous system. The plague is treating Haven itself as a body." His scientific lexicon was failing him. The words tasted like ash. He felt like a pre-Cascade astronomer trying to explain a supernova to a medieval peasant. The language didn't exist. "It's evolving," he whispered. "Or it's not evolving, it's calibrating. First, it needed sound. Then it needed air. Now it just needs proximity to the system. It's learning the architecture. The biomechanical shrine in the refinery, that wasn't a symbol. That was a peripheral, an antenna, a way for it to interface more directly with the structure. And we're just components to be assimilated." Jorin finally stopped pacing. He stared at his own hands, half expecting to see them glowing. The rational framework that had been his armor for decades was not just cracked, it had been atomized. He was naked in the face of an impossible truth. His life's work was a footnote to a cosmic horror he couldn't even name. Brecker let out a slow, deliberate breath. He pulled a sterile cleansing wipe and a pressure bandage from his medkit. He didn't look at Jorin. He just started cleaning his wound, his movements precise and grimly methodical. The chemical scent of the wipe was sharp in the dead air. "So, you're saying your science is useless?" Brecker stated. It wasn't an accusation. It was a fact. Jorin flinched as if struck. "I'm saying my science is incomplete. It's like trying to understand the ocean with only a bucket. The data set is wrong. The entire paradigm is wrong."
Right. Brecker wrapped the bandage tightly around his forearm, covering the gash and the faint glowing lines. He pulled his sleeve down over it. So all that fancy talk about carrier waves and resonance, what does it mean for this? He tapped his bandaged arm. Am I on a timer? Am I going to start singing to the walls and trying to merge with a water purifier? Jorin stared at the covered wound, the terrifying evidence now hidden from view. His composure was gone, replaced by a raw, chilling vulnerability. He had no answers, only bigger, more monstrous questions. I don't know, he said, and the admission was the most honest thing he'd said in years. I don't know. The silence that followed was heavier than before. It was the silence of two men trapped in a forgotten box who had just realized they were not fighting a plague. They were living inside the body of a god, and it was beginning to notice them. The comms link died with a final definitive crackle of static. In the sudden silence of the auxiliary hub, the ambient sounds of Haven rushed in to fill the void. A slow, rhythmic drip of condensation plopped from a corroded pipe onto a puddle of rust-colored water near Jorin's boot. The low electric hum of the life support systems vibrated up through the grated floor, a constant reminder of the Arkology's failing metabolism. Brecker stood with his back to him, a broad silhouette against the sickly green glow of an attrition-paced advertisement flickering on a screen across the corridor. The enforcer hadn't moved since severing his connection to Hydrocorpus, to the masters who had just ordered Jorin's death. The air, thick with the smell of ozone and wet metal, felt heavy in Jorin's lungs. He was a fugitive. Theologian Jorin Vask, the Directorate's sharpest instrument for excising the cancer of belief, was now the system's most wanted pathogen. His name, his face, his entire professional existence, all repurposed into the avatar of a terrorist. A profound, shaking vulnerability washed over him, cold and damp as the walls of this forgotten comm station. He had built his life on a foundation of observable facts and rational systems. Now that foundation was gone, revealed as nothing more than a thin crust of concrete over a lightless, drowning abyss. He watched Brecker's shoulders, waiting for the enforcer to turn, to raise his sidearm and finish the job his former masters had assigned. It would be the logical thing to do. Fulfill the contract, get back in their good graces. But Brecker just stood there, a statue carved from corporate violence and bellows grit. So, Jorin's voice was a ragged whisper, swallowed by the room's oppressive acoustics. What now? Brecker finally turned, his face unreadable in the gloom. The augmetic plates around his left eye were dark, their indicator lights extinguished when he'd killed his comms. Now, we keep our footing. He used the common Haven greeting, but it was devoid of pleasantry. It was a statement of grim, immediate fact. And we find a hole deep enough that the Directorate can't reach. A flicker. On a bank of monitors to their right, a single screen, long dead and webbed with a spider fracture across its glass, stuttered to life. It didn't boot up, it simply became. A field of pure digital black, deeper than the surrounding shadows. A single green cursor pulsed in the top left corner, once. Twice. Brecker stiffened, his hand instinctively moving to the pistol holstered at his hip. What is that? Directorate trace? No, Jorin said, his throat tight. A trace would have been a cascade of alerts, a blaring alarm. This was different. This was quiet. This was deliberate. A cold dread, sharper than his earlier vulnerability, began to prickle at his skin. He knew that quiet deliberation. The cursor blinked again, then moved,
leaving a trail of glowing green characters in its wake. The letters appeared not in a block, but one by one, with the distinct rhythmic cadence of someone typing. Logic is a beautiful thing, Theologian. Jorin felt the blood drain from his face. Gisela, the data broker, the ungrounded drifter he had so arrogantly dismissed. Her voice was there in the syntax, in the condescending honorific. He could almost hear her dry, mocking tone. More text bloomed on the screen. Until it gets you killed. The words hung there, a digital epitaph for his entire worldview. Humiliation, hot and sharp, pierced through the cold dread. She had warned him. She had told him the directorate's truth was a curated lie, and he had thrown it back in her face, secure in his position, his access, his logic. And now here he stood, stripped of everything, a rat in a maze designed by the very people he served, while she watched from some hidden corner of the network, a ghost in the machine he could no longer control. "Rust rot," Brecker muttered, stepping closer to the console. "Who the hell is this?" "The woman I told you about," Jorin gritted out, the words tasting like ash. "The data broker, Gisela Rask." "The one with the logs?" "The one I should have listened to." The admission was agony. It was an acknowledgement that his entire methodology, the clinical detachment and rigorous analysis that defined him, had been a catastrophic failure. The cursor blinked, erasing the previous lines. "I see your corporate muscle finally cut his leash. Smart boy. But you're both still thinking like you have a place in this city. You don't. Otho Valerius has rewritten your designation. You are no longer Jorin Vask, Forensic Theologian. You are Contaminant 734, a data point to be scrubbed. Contaminant 734. The impersonal number was more chilling than any death sentence. It was the language of system maintenance, of debugging. It was Otho's language. It was his language. "She's lying," Jorin snapped, a reflexive denial, but he knew she wasn't. The calm serenity on Otho's face when he declared Jorin a terrorist, it wasn't the fury of a betrayed superior. It was the detached focus of an engineer correcting a system flaw. "Am I?" The cursor pulsed, mocking him. "Go on. Look out the viewport. Level Gamma 7, reclamation sector. See for yourself how your old boss handles a data scrub." Jorin hesitated. He felt pinned, a specimen under a microscope. Every action he took was predictable, another data point for her smug analysis. But he had to know. Brecker was already moving. He strode to the thick polymer glass viewport that overlooked a sprawling cavern of the bellows. The pane was slick with years of accumulated grime and condensation. Using the reinforced sleeve of his jacket, he scraped a wide arc of filth away, revealing the scene outside. Jorin came to stand beside him, his breath catching in his throat. Below them, catwalks crisscrossed a chasm lit by the erratic strobing of dying work lamps and the pervasive soft glow of fungal farms. But that wasn't what held his gaze. Moving through the corridors with an unnerving fluid grace were things that did not belong. They weren't human. They were machines. Automated security drones, models Jorin had only seen in directorate schematics. They looked like chrome and carbon fiber insects, multi-limbed and sleek, scuttling along walls and ceilings as easily as they did the floor. Red optical sensors sliced through the gloom. They weren't making arrests. They weren't issuing warnings.
One of the drones cornered a small group of dampskins, a family by the looks of it, huddled in the alcove of a sealed shipping container. The drone's forelimbs unfolded, not with cuffs, but with needle-tipped injectors and high-frequency blades. There was no negotiation, no plea, just a silent, efficient, automated slaughter. The bodies crumpled, and the drone moved on, its sensor sweeping the area for the next target. "My debt is to the bellows." Brecker's voice was a low growl filled with a fresh, terrible rage. He had just turned his back on one monster, only to be faced with a legion of them, unleashed upon his people. Jorin felt a wave of nausea. This was the hygienic purge, Otho's final, rational solution. There was no malice in it, just cold, absolute logic. The populace was contaminated data. The drones were the delete key. He turned away from the window, his face pale. On the monitor, new text awaited them. "See? No warrants, no trials, just a cleanup protocol. You can't run, you can't hide, not in their system. My offer still stands, Theologian. I have the unredacted logs, the real truth about Haven, about what's sleeping in the deep brine. But the price has gone up. You don't just need my information anymore. You need my map. I can get you through the places their drones can't go, places they don't even know exist. Meet me. The Stillness. Pylon 1138, Sublevel 9. Come alone, or with your dog, your choice. But come soon. Logic is getting you killed." The cursor blinked one last time, and the screen went black, returning to its fractured, dead state. The silence it left behind was heavier than before.
Jorin stared at the dark screen, his own reflection a ghostly, distorted mask in the cracked glass. The stillness, the cult's heartland, the place where the water didn't ripple right, where the song of the brine was strongest, a place his science couldn't explain and his sanity couldn't withstand. Humiliation gave way to a surge of pure vitriolic anger, at Otho for his monstrous logic, at the chorus for their infectious madness, but most of all at Gisla, at the smug, arrogant drifter who had been right. She had him. She had cornered him with nothing but the truth. His structured world was a bonfire, and she was the only one offering a bucket of water, a bucket filled with the very poison he had sworn to eradicate. He slammed his fist against the metal console, the impact rattling the entire bank of monitors. "Rust rot!" Brecker looked from the viewport back to Jorin, his face grim. "She's right," he said, his voice flat. "Those things, they're not patrols. They're exterminators. We stay in the bellows, we're dead. We try for the Arium, we're dead." He nodded toward the dark screen. "I don't trust her, but she's the only one with a different map." Jorin didn't answer. He just stared at his fractured reflection, trapped between the cold, logical death of the machine and the warm, terrifying embrace of the deep. The air in the comms hub was thick with the scent of a lightning strike. Ozone, sharp and sterile, clung to the back of Jorin's throat, a phantom taste of the plasma cutter Gisla had used to carve their escape. The small, forgotten chamber was a bubble of silence, suspended above chaos, wedged between two groaning support pylons. The only light came from the data pad in Gisla's hands and the sickly green glow of phosphorescent fungus creeping up the viewport. Every surface was slick with the Arkology's perpetual sweat.
Jorin's heart still hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a frantic counterpoint to the deep, resonant thrum of the city's bones. Humiliation burned hotter than the adrenaline.
hunted, cornered, rescued. Each word was a lash. He, Jorin Vask, the scalpel of the Directorate, had been reduced to a cornered animal, saved by an ungrounded data broker he'd intended to hunt down. He watched her now, her silhouette stark against the glow of her screen. She hadn't spoken a word, not since her clipped pronouncement in the corridor. She moved with an unnerving economy, her silence more commanding than any shout. Brecker stood by the sealed hatch, his massive frame filling the doorway. The enforcer was breathing heavily, his augmented fist clenching and unclenching. He had made his choice, betrayed his masters. For what? To be chaperoned by a ghost from the Bellows black market? His gaze flickered between Jorin and Gisla, a man caught between two competing brands of madness. "So," Jorin finally broke the silence, his voice raw. "You have a flair for the dramatic. What now? We can't stay here. Those drones will be mapping thermal signatures." He was trying to reclaim some semblance of control, to impose logic on the situation. It was all he had left. Gisla didn't look up from her datapad. Instead, she lifted a hand and pointed a single, slender finger toward the large, grime-streaked viewport. Jorin's jaw tightened. He hated being directed like a child. Still, he moved, his boots sticking to the corroded deck plating. The viewport was a meter-wide circle of polymer glass, warped by decades of pressure. A film of condensation blurred the world outside. He wiped a smear of it with the heel of his hand, the glass cold and unyielding against his skin. And he saw them. Below, a wide maintenance catwalk stretched over a chasm of darkness, connecting their section of the bellows to the distant, humming mass of the resonance station they had just fled. And on the catwalk, there was a procession. It wasn't a crowd, it was a line. A slow, shuffling, inexorable line of people. Men and women in the gray fatigues of refinery workers and protein farmers. They moved with a horrifying lack of purpose. Heads lolled, arms hung limp. They didn't look at their feet, yet they never stumbled. They just walked. A faint, pulsing blue-green light emanated from them, visible even through the gloom, a soft glow beneath the skin of their necks and along their forearms, tracing veins and capillaries in alien patterns. Early-stage infection, the chanting sickness before the chanting began. Jorin's mind, his fortress of rationalism, immediately began constructing walls. A psychotropic agent, he muttered, more to himself than the others. Dispersed in the station, it induces a fugue state, impairs motor control. They're just wandering. Brecker moved to his side, his large frame crowding the viewport. He let out a low breath. "Wandering where, Vask? They're all going the same way." "Towards the epicenter of the dispersal. It's a predictable, behavioral tropism." The words felt hollow, a flimsy shield of jargon against a terrifying truth. He watched one woman, her hair matted with moisture, her face utterly vacant. Her lips were parted, but no sound came out. She looked like a sleepwalker dreaming of a place she had to be, a place she was being called to. Then Gisla's datapad chimed softly. Jorin tore his eyes from the window. She held the device up, the screen angled for them to read. Harsh white text glowed against a black background. "They aren't wandering." Jorin felt a fresh spike of anger. "Then what are they doing? Explain yourself. We don't have time for cryptic messages." Gisla's fingers moved, a silent staccato of taps. The text refreshed. "They're being pulled." "Pulled?" Jorin scoffed, the sound sharp and brittle. "Pulled by what?
Some mystical force, the will of your drowned god? Don't waste my time with cultist nonsense." Her expression didn't change. It was a mask of calm focus. She simply tilted the datapad again, the screen's glare catching the moisture in her eyes. "The hum." Jorin stared at the words. The metal hum. That old bellow superstition, the madness born from resonating machinery. His official reports had classified it as a localized auditory phenomenon causing mild paranoia. A footnote. "It isn't just noise," the text continued. "It's a carrier wave, a beacon. The plague spreads through the water, yes, through the spores, but it is guided by the hum." The deep thrum of the Arkology seemed to intensify, shifting from background noise to a physical presence. Jorin felt it in his teeth, in the bones of his skull. The procession outside continued its silent, horrifying pilgrimage. "I've been mapping it for weeks," Gisela typed, "tracking the harmonics, the resonance spikes. The city is a web of these frequencies. Some are weak, some are strong." She lifted her gaze from the screen, her eyes finally meeting Jorin's. They were dark, ancient, filled with a certainty that chilled him to the core. With one last tap, she delivered the final blow. "The station you ran to, it's the strongest hotspot on this entire level, a death trap. You ran straight into the flame." Jorin felt the floor drop out from under him. It wasn't a physical sensation, but a complete collapse of his intellectual world. The data points clicked into place with the sickening finality of a tomb door sealing shut. It wasn't random. It wasn't a biological contagion spreading by mere proximity. It was organized, targeted. It had infrastructure. The plague was hijacking the city's own decay, turning the sounds of its slow death into a shepherd's call. These people weren't sick. They were being summoned. This wasn't a disease he was fighting. It was a migration. His theories, his life's work, the entire foundation of forensic theology, it was all based on the premise that faith was a chaotic human flaw, a cognitive virus that spread erratically through populations drowning in despair. But this had a map. This had a pattern that existed outside the human mind, a pattern he, the expert in patterns, had been utterly blind to. He had been looking at the symptoms on the patient, while the true disease was in the architecture of the hospital itself. Humiliation gave way to a cold, profound horror that seeped into his bones. He was not the doctor studying a plague. He was a child throwing rocks at a tidal wave, arrogantly believing he could chart the ripples. He pressed his palm flat against the cold, wet polymer glass of the viewport, staring at the line of shuffling, illuminated figures, moths to a flame. In the distorted reflection, his own face stared back, pale, wide-eyed, a mask of dawning terror. For the first time, he felt the deep hum not just in his ears, but as a pull in the base of his spine, a faint, seductive whisper promising a place in the chorus. He snatched his hand back as if the glass had burned him. Brecker swore under his breath, a low, guttural sound. "Rust rot! I know some of them." Gisela lowered her datapad, plunging the hub back into the dim, fungal glow. She watched Jorin, her face unreadable in the shadows, her silence now feeling less like an affectation and more like the quiet patience of someone who had understood the truth for a very, very long time. The quiet was the most unnerving thing. Not silence. Haven was never silent, but a profound, muffled quiet.
The constant deep groan of the Arkology's metal bones was distant, the ever-present hum of distant machinery reduced to a faint vibration in the soles of my boots. Here, in the skeletal remains of a pre-cascade comms hub, the only sharp sounds were the rhythmic plink, plink, plink of condensation dripping from a corroded conduit onto a panel of dead glass, and the ragged tempo of my own breathing. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and decades of fried circuitry, a metallic sharpness that overlaid the usual fungal dampness. Brecker stood by the doorframe, a mountain of augmented muscle silhouetted against the gloom of the outer catwalk. His heavy caliber sidearm was holstered, but his hand never strayed far from it. He hadn't said a word since he'd cut his comms, since he'd chosen me, the pariah, the corporate liability, over his masters at Hydrocorpus. His betrayal was a weight between us, a fragile, unspoken contract written in paranoia. Every time a new drop of water echoed in the oppressive quiet, I expected him to reconsider, to see me for what I was, a rust-rotten investment, a dead man walking. My face was everywhere. Fugitive Zero, the man who weaponized a sickness. They'd twisted my investigation, my desperate attempts at containment, into a deliberate act of terror. Otho's final, perfect move. He'd made me the disease he needed to eradicate. And now I was hiding in the dark with a man who had every reason, every order to put a round through my skull. I ran a hand over my face, the skin clammy. The hub was a wreck. Banks of monitors stared back like vacant eyes, coated in a fine grime of grime. Wires spilled from wall cavities like metallic intestines. This place was supposed to be a temporary refuge, a tactical choice, a communications black hole too old and derelict for the Directorate's modern tracking systems, a logical fallback, rational. Then the quiet was broken. A shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness of the doorway. It was smaller than Brecker, leaner. It moved with a fluid grace that was utterly alien to the enforcer's coiled stillness. Brecker tensed, his body shifting almost imperceptibly, his hand finally closing around the grip of his weapon. "What was that?" I hissed, my voice cracking. The figure stepped fully into the weak, flickering light of a single emergency LED. It was the woman from the refinery, the data broker, Gisela. She wasn't armed, not in any way that was obvious. She held a data pad, its screen casting an intricate, shifting pattern of blue and sickly green light onto her face. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion and unnerving calm. She looked like she belonged here, in the rot and the decay, more than I ever had in my sterile Arium office. "Took you long enough?" she said, her voice even, without a trace of the fear that was currently strangling my lungs. "I was beginning to think you'd gotten yourselves deleted." Brecker took a half-step forward. "Who the rust-rot are you? How did you find us?" Gisela didn't even look at him. Her eyes, dark and intelligent, were fixed on me. "I didn't have to find you. I knew you'd be here." My mind raced, cycling through possibilities, probabilities, tactical analyses. A tracker? An informant? Had Brecker's betrayal been a feint? "That's not possible," I said, the words a weak defense against your certainty. "This hub is offline. Analog wreckage. It's off every network map." "And that's the point," she replied, taking another step into the room. She held up the data pad. On its screen was a schematic of this bellows sector,
but it was overlaid with a crawling, pulsing miasma of color. A tide of sickly greens and deep violets flowed through the digital corridors, representing something. The song, I realized, with a jolt of ice in my gut. The mimetic plague. She had mapped it. And right where we stood, the comms hub was a pocket of inert black. A void. You think you're hiding from the directorate. You are. But more importantly, you're hiding from the chorus, from the signal. You picked this place because it's shielded, old tech, but the real reason you're safe here is because it's an acoustic shadow, a deaf zone. I stared at the map, my entire rational framework beginning to buckle. Acoustic shadow. It was a term from hydrography, from pre-cascade physics, an area sound waves can't reach. She was applying it to a psychic phenomenon, to faith. It was absurd. It was impossible. Metal hum madness, I breathed, the phrase coming back to me from old Bellows case files. The local superstition, the informal rituals. You're saying it's real. Madness is what you call something you don't understand, she corrected, her tone sharp, clinical. It was the tone I used to use. It's a resonance, a frequency. The entity in the stillness, it sings. The plague is just its voice, amplified by the Arkology's own systems. The hum of the purifiers, the vibrations in the pylons. It uses our city as its choir. But not here. She tapped the datapad again. This hub was built with pre-cascade military-grade signal dampening, lead-lined walls, chaotic insulation patterns. It doesn't just block radio, it physically breaks up the resonant frequencies. It creates a pocket of silence. The song can't get in. I felt the floor drop out from under me. All my logic, my careful deconstruction of belief as pathology, it was all useless. I hadn't found this place through superior intellect. I was just an animal, running from a predator, and I had stumbled into a cave it couldn't enter. She hadn't tracked me with technology. She had predicted my behavior by understanding the very force I was trying to debunk. My horrified realization gave way to something colder, heavier, resignation. She saw the shift in my eyes. She had me, cornered not by walls or weapons, but by irrefutable, impossible data. Brecker grunted, lowering his hand from his gun. "So what do you want?" "The same thing I wanted before," Gisela said, her gaze returning to me. "Access. The unredacted founding logs. My parents were on the survey team that discovered the non-critical geological anomaly. Hydrocorpus buried them, and they buried the data. That data is in a server vault in the upper stillness. It's the source code for all of this." "And you need me," I said, the words tasting like ash. "An official, high-clearance login, a ghost in the system."
You're a Fugitive Zero with nothing left to lose and a directorate-level encryption key burned into your cortex, she stated matter-of-factly. I have the map, the real map. I can get us through the infected zones, through the song. You can't survive 10 corridors out there without me, and I can't open the final door without you. It wasn't an offer. It was a diagnosis, a statement of fact. My entire life had been dedicated to proving that faith was a delusion. Now my only path to survival, my only chance to find a truth that could absolve the catastrophe I had unleashed, was to follow a woman who navigated the world using a madman's map of a ghost's song. I looked from her unwavering eyes to the pulsing alien tide on her datapad, and then to the suffocating silent dark that surrounded us. I was out of options, out of theories, out of time. My shoulders sagged, a puppet with its strings cut.
Gisla gave a single sharp nod, a flicker of something that might have been grim satisfaction. She lowered the datapad. "Good," she said. "Let's go for a swim." The plasma cutter hissed as Gisla dropped it onto a rusted service panel, the glowing cherry red of its emitter fading to a dull metal gray. The air in the cramped space was thick with the smell of scorched ozone and burnt plastic, a sharp overlay on the usual bellows perfume of damp rust and fungal spores. Gisla slammed her shoulder against a heavy ventilation grate, sliding it shut with a grating shriek of metal on metal. A final click, and the sound of the hunting drones, their whining servos and automated directives, was cut off, replaced by the intimate hum of failing electronics. We were in a comms hub, or what was left of one. A claustrophobic nest of thick, greasy data cables drooped from the ceiling like dead vines. Racks of servers, their indicator lights mostly dark, lined one wall, their metal cases slick with condensation. In a corner, a patch of pale green algae pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence, casting our faces in a ghoulish light. Brecker leaned against the sealed grate, his massive frame taking up a quarter of the room. His augmented chest plate rose and fell in heavy, controlled rhythm, the only sound louder than the constant, maddening drip of water from a corroded pipe overhead.
I didn't give myself a moment to process the escape. Adrenaline was a poor substitute for reason, and I needed reason now more than ever. My entire world had been inverted in the span of hours. Fugitive, terrorist, scapegoat. The words were meaningless labels, yet they clung to me, heavier than the waterlogged air. I turned on Gisla. She was already working, her fingers flying across the surface of a grimy, flickering touchscreen, coaxing life from the dead hub. Why? She didn't look up. Her focus was absolute, her face illuminated by the glitching blue light of the monitor. The drones were on a network kill sweep. They weren't trying to arrest you. Saving you seemed like the more interesting option. "I'm not interested in your entertainment." My voice was a low rasp. "You risked yourself. People like you, ungrounded data brokers, don't take risks without a price. So what is it? What do you want from me?" Brecker shifted, the leather of his gear creaking. A warning. He had chosen my side over his master's, but his trust was a brittle, unproven thing. He was watching me, watching her, calculating. "I told you," Gista said, her tone flat, distracted. She tapped a final sequence, and a schematic flared on the screen, a web of blue lines that was immediately corrupted by a cascade of red error messages. She let out a frustrated hiss. "Rust rat." She finally turned to me, her eyes dark and intense in the monitor glow. "I need access. I need to get into the stillness, deeper than the scavengers go. And you're my key." My mind raced, categorizing, analyzing. The stillness was the epicenter. It was the source, but her goal was misaligned with the threat. "You want to go into the heart of the plague? For what, salvage? There's nothing down there but water, pressure, and them." "There's data," she countered, her voice dropping, gaining an edge of obsession. "The primary archives, the unredacted founding logs for the entire Arkology. They're stored on hardened servers in the pre-Cascade Foundation, sublevel 0.
I almost laughed. The sheer absurdity of it. The city was tearing itself apart in a pandemic of consciousness, and she was hunting for a history file? That's your price? A history lesson? The plague is airborne. The Directorate is executing civilians. Otho has branded me a terrorist, and you want to go on a deep-dive expedition to read century-old schematics? My suspicion, a cold and familiar certainty, settled in my gut. It was a grift. The logs were a myth, a MacGuffin. She was using me, using the chaos. What are they really worth, Gisela? On the black market? Unredacted hydrocorpus data from the founding. You could buy your way into the Arium for life with that. Is that the end game? You save the public enemy, use him to bypass the chorus and the security patrols, and cash in? For the first time, her mask of cool pragmatism cracked. A flicker of genuine anger flashed in her eyes. You think this is about kilocals? She took a step closer, her voice a low, dangerous growl. Brecker tensed, his hand instinctively going to the grip of the heavy pistol holstered on his thigh. "Keep your voice down!" she snapped, her whisper more potent than a shout. She jabbed a finger back at the corrupted schematic on her screen. "You're a theologian, Vask. You look at this plague and you see a disease of the soul, a mimetic virus. You want to dissect belief." I paused. "You're looking in the wrong place. And you think the answer is in a server room?" I shot back. "That's a delusion of a different stripe, a technician's fantasy." Her face hardened. The anger was gone, replaced by a profound, hollowed-out weariness that seemed far older than her years. "My parents were Rask and Ilara." I paused. "They were lead data archivists for Hydrocorpus, assigned to the 75-year Systems Integrity Review." The names meant nothing to me, just two more cogs in the Directorate's vast machine. "They worked in the Arium," she continued, her gaze turning inward toward a memory. "Dry feats. They believed in the system. Structured survivalism, mental hygiene, all of it. They believed meaning was found in function. Their function was to ensure the Arkology's data was pure, its history stable." She looked at me then, a direct, piercing stare. "And then they disappeared." I stayed silent. Disappearances weren't uncommon. Reintegration therapy, kilocal debt servitude, accidents in the reclamation workshops. The system had 1,000 quiet ways of deleting people. "It wasn't quiet," Gisela said, as if reading my thoughts. "They weren't reassigned. They were erased. Their files, their housing permits, their medical records, their names from the roster, everything. It was a complete systemic purge, as if they never existed." Her voice was clinical, devoid of self-pity. She was presenting evidence, not soliciting sympathy. It was a language I understood, a cold, logical anomaly. "How do you know?" I asked, my own voice softer now. "Because they missed the spot," she said, a bitter twist to her lips. "A corrupted fragment on a personal terminal they kept off network. A single encrypted log entry from my mother. It took me 5 years to crack it." She turned back to the screen and typed. The corrupted schematic vanished, replaced by a single block of text. It was mostly garbled, a stream of alphanumeric gibberish, but a few phrases were clear. "Structural non sequitur in vent sector gamma. Resonant frequency doesn't match geothermal output. It's not a geological anomaly. It's biological. And the plumbing is routed to it, like a circulatory system. They knew. From the beginning, they knew." I stared at the words, the blood draining from my face. My neat clinical diagnosis of a mimetic pathogen spreading through a stressed populace felt suddenly, terrifyingly inadequate. A child's drawing of a monster. This was something else. This was architecture. "They found something in the original plans," Gisela stated, her voice barely a whisper.
anomalies, things that didn't make sense from an engineering perspective, power conduits that led nowhere, life support systems that seemed pathologically redundant, almost like they were meant to support something else, something that wasn't human. She finally looked away from the screen, her gaze locking with mine. The intrigued suspicion I felt was curdling into a specific, targeted dread. The world wasn't just irrational, it was malignant by design.
They were silenced because they found the truth, Vask. This thing, this god the chorus worships, it wasn't an accident. It wasn't something we discovered and built on top of. I think it's the reason Haven was built here at all. Her voice was steady, a lighthouse beam in the storm of my collapsing worldview. The answer isn't in theology. It's not in your study of faith as a disease. It's in the unredacted engineering specs, in the math. The truth of what's happening to us is written in concrete and steel and wiring diagrams, and I am going to find it. The air in the comms hub was thick with the aftersmell of violence. Acrid ozone from Gisla's plasma cutter, the sharp tang of superheated metal. The circular hole she'd carved into the maintenance duct still glowed a faint angry orange at its edges. Condensation was already beginning to bead on the molten rim, each drop hitting the grated floor with a sound like a pinprick against the oppressive quiet. We stood in a triangle of pure, distilled distrust. Me, the fallen academic; Brecker, the silent, augmented giant whose loyalties were a freshly broken bone, still seeking a way to set; and her. She moved with an unnerving economy, deactivating the cutter with a practiced flick of her thumb. It hissed, the thermal bleed venting in a shimmering wave that distorted the air. She wasn't breathing heavily. Her eyes, dark and quick, flickered between me and Brecker, cataloging threats, assessing weaknesses. She was ungrounded, but not in the way the directorate painted them, not a desperate scavenger, but a predator in her own ecosystem. Every piece of her gear, from the scuffed magnetic clamps on her boots to the heavily modified data pad strapped to her forearm, was salvaged but meticulously maintained. My face, the face of Fugitive Zero, was probably still flickering on the very monitors she had just bypassed. The irony was a bitter acid in my throat. "Gisla Rask," I said. It wasn't a question. My years in forensic theology had been spent analyzing belief systems, but the core of the work was pattern recognition. I recognized the pattern of a professional. The data broker from the bellows periphery. They say you can find any data stream in Haven if the price is right.
Her lips, chapped and pale, pulled into something that wasn't a smile. They say a lot of things. Her voice was low, raspy from the unfiltered air of the lower levels. Right now, every public screen says Jorin Vask unleashed a plague on Haven. They say you're a terrorist, worth more dead than alive. Beside me, Brecker shifted his weight. The movement was slight, but it was accompanied by the soft whine of stressed myomers in his legs, a low-tide warning. His hand rested near the heavy-caliber pistol at his thigh. Gisla's eyes snapped to the motion, her own hand dropping to a wicked-looking blade sheathed upside down on her chest rig. "Enough," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. I raised a placating hand, a gesture that felt laughably inadequate. "We don't have time for this." I looked directly at Gisla, forcing myself to hold her gaze. It felt like staring into a deep-water trench, unsure of what might be looking back. "The Directorate is hunting me, which means they are now hunting anyone who helps me. You didn't cut your way in here to turn us in. What do you want?"
I want what was stolen from my family, she said, the words clipped. The truth about Haven's founding, the unredacted logs. Otho Valerius has them, the same man who put your face on every kill-on-sight order. Your enemy is my target. I processed that. A vendetta, a motive I could understand. It was transactional, clean, far better than faith. I don't have access to those logs anymore, I stated, the admission galling. Otho has locked me out of everything. I know, she replied, but you know the systems, the architecture, the back doors you built to spy on the cults. You're a key I can't forge. And you need to get into the stillness, where the chorus is strongest, a place I can navigate with my eyes closed. It was a stalemate, a negotiation. She needed my knowledge. I needed her geography. My entire life had been a crusade against unsanctioned belief, against the chaos of the ungrounded. Now my survival depended on one. My past self, the clinical, arrogant theologian from the Arium, screamed in protest from a deep, drowned part of my mind. I ignored him. He was dead anyway, murdered by Otho on a citywide broadcast. A demonstration of value, I said, the corporate jargon tasting like rust. A gesture of good faith. I unslung my own directorate-issue datapad. Its polished polymer case felt alien in my hands now, a relic from another life. My fingers flew across the screen, muscle memory I thought I'd lost. I bypassed my own user credentials, diving into the subroutines I'd used 100 times to isolate and analyze mimetic code. I found what I was looking for, a firewalled directory of low-level archival data. Pre-cascade historical fragments, redacted directorate personnel files from a decade ago, geological surveys of the Arkology's foundations, nothing that could compromise current operations, nothing Otho would miss, but for a data broker like Gisela, it was a lockbox of forgotten currency. It was a test for both of us. If I gave her too much, she'd know I was desperate and foolish. Too little, and she'd see it as an insult. I carved out a single access key, encrypted it in a disposable data packet, and held the datapad out. Directorate archive key, level 3, old files, but unredacted. Gisela didn't move for a long moment. The only sounds were the omnipresent drip, drip, drip of water and the low resonant hum of the Arkology's metal bones. Then she raised her own forearm, the screen of her datapad flickering to life. A mesh of complex, unfamiliar code spiraled across it. "Send it," she commanded. I initiated the transfer. A thin beam of sickly green light shot from my device to hers. On her screen, I saw the packet arrive and immediately become encased in layers of her diagnostic programs. Red lines of code swarmed it like antibodies, probing, dissecting. She was checking for trackers, logic bombs, directorate poison pills. Her focus was absolute. I felt a strange, detached flicker of professional respect. She was good. The red lines vanished. She let out a soft, almost inaudible breath. "It's clean." She looked up, and for the first time the aggressive suspicion in her eyes was tempered by something else. Acknowledgement. "And it's real." She nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture. Her fingers danced across her screen, and a moment later a packet was sent back to me. My pad chimed soft.
On my screen, 2 files appeared. The first was a blueprint of a mid-level bellows sector. A single location pulsed with a soft, bioluminescent marker. A label next to it read, Chorus Way Station, Echo Chamber 7.
The second file was a live topographical map of Haven Signal Network. Vast swaths of it were shaded in a shifting, amorphous gray. "The way station is your best bet for finding Kalis Rendor," she explained, her tone all business. "The gray areas are def zones, signal bleed from old machinery, overlapping frequencies, structural deadening. Directorate comms and surveillance can't penetrate them, neither can their drones targeting systems. Keep to the gray and you're a ghost." I stared at the map. It was a road map to invisibility, a key to survival I could never have accessed through official channels. It was forbidden knowledge, born from the cracks in the system I once upheld. The exchange was complete. We stood in the flickering light, three fugitives bound by nothing more than mutual need. No handshakes, no promises, just the cold, hard reality of the transaction. "This is a temporary arrangement," I said, needing to draw the line, to maintain some semblance of control. "Don't worry," Gisela said, a hint of sarcasm in her voice. "I'm not looking for friends." She gestured with the still warm plasma cutter toward the smoking vent. "I created a temporary power surge in this sector. We have maybe 10 minutes before a maintenance crew responds." Brecker finally spoke. His voice was a low rumble that cut through the tension. "The way station. How far?" I looked at the map, then at the smoking hole in the wall. The path forward was into darkness, into the very systems of belief I had sought to dismantle. And for the first time, I was going in blind, guided by ghosts and shadows. We were no longer predator and prey. We were simply a pack, and we were being hunted.